Play, and I've got with me Daphne Bramham with the Vancouver Sun, and she's just released a book on the FLDS and Bountiful and all the other things we've been discussing at Sioux today. So welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, why don't you just let us know a little bit about the book? It's I'll be up front. This is going to be a softball interview anyway. So.
Well, the book's called The Secret Saints, Child Brides and Lost Boys in Canada's Polygamous Mormon Sect, and it's published by Random House. The book traces the history of the Mormons in Canada and the split between the so-called fundamentalist Mormons and the mainstream church sometime after 1890, when the mainstream church outlawed the practice of polygamy. Fundamentalist Mormons believe that they are the only true followers of Joseph Smith because they believe that polygamy, or taking plural wives, is important and necessary to get into the highest realm of heaven.
Okay, thanks. Now, one of the things that's come up recently in the news is this whole thing down in Texas, and I think as Canadians we sort of look at this and we look at Texas and we say that's kind of remote, but there's a Canadian connection here.
There are Canadian women that are in the compound in Texas. They're girls who were married, were sent down to Texas or sent down to Utah or Arizona to be married to much older men as part of the transporting of brides. And the reason there's a transporting of brides, of course, is that this is a group that doesn't proselytize. They don't go out and look for people to join the group. They simply multiply. So the gene pool is getting relatively shallow in both Canada and the United States. So by transporting brides back and forth, it's an attempt to stave off some of the birth defects that come with intermarriage.
Sure.
So there are Canadians in that compound. There are Canadian children in the compound as well.
Yeah. What can these Canadian women and children and young men expect in that compound?
Well, what all of them can expect, whether they're in Texas or whether they're in Canada, is that they will be taught from birth that they must be obedient to the prophet. They believe that the prophet is the mouthpiece of God. They believe that he speaks directly to God and gets revelations from God. Women and girls are taught that they must be strictly obedient to their fathers, then to their husbands. They're told to give themselves mind, body, and soul to their husbands. They are not allowed to have free thought because they are taught that only men can really be close to God. The way for a woman to get into heaven is to be invited by her husband, so she wants to be a good wife and a good mother.
Yeah.
As for the boys, they're taught that they must be obedient as well, because if they're not, they won't get any wives, because in this group all of the marriages are done by assignment and by revelation. They believe that the prophet gets a revelation from God,
Sure.
telling them who to marry.
Yeah. Now, one thing you mentioned is that it's in Canada. I'm not sure if everyone sort of understands where it is in Canada or that this is happening in Canada. Is this the Bountiful BC group?
Yeah, Bountiful, British Columbia is actually not a real place. It's what they call their community, which is actually in the real community of Lister, BC, which is in the southeast corner of the province. The closest town to it is Creston, and it's about a 10-minute walk across the border into the United States and into Idaho. The people who live within the so-called Bountiful community, they don't all live on one piece of property. Some of them live in other little towns around there.
Sure.
And many of the boys and the men go to work in Alberta, and they work in logging camps and lumber mills and so on in southern Alberta as well.
Now, you mentioned there were about 1,200 divided between two groups. About 700 are with the former bishop there, James Blackmore. And
Winston Blackmore.
Winston, sorry. I'm thinking in old tobacco in Virginia. And that the other group still follow Warren Jeffs, the FLDS prophet, for lack of a better word. We hear stories coming out of these compounds of abuse of child brides, of pregnant 14-year-olds. Is this happening in Canada as well, or is this just an anomaly down in Texas?
No, it's happening in Canada as well. The youngest bride that I know of was 13 in Bountiful. Winston Blackmore, who was the former bishop, has publicly said, both at a public meeting in Creston and on Larry King Live, that he has had several very young girls as wives. The youngest one was 15. Winston Blackmore has had 26 wives. He has 116 children. And there are others there, other men there have multiple wives. Jim Oler is the bishop of the FLDS group. He has a half a dozen or so wives and 40 or so children. And girls are being forced into marriages and put into marriages at very young ages in Canada as well, and they have been for some long time.
Yeah. Why is it that this is allowed to go on?
There are a couple of reasons. One of it is that the fundamentalist Mormons always choose very remote places to set up their communities, so they stay away from prying eyes. They're hardworking. They do spend a lot of money when they go into Creston because they've got large families. And they are taught to keep sweet, so they look like they're healthy and happy, and people don't want to bug them too much.
Yeah.
The other reason that they've been left alone is that in 1990, the provincial government, the New Democrats were in power at the time. They had an opinion from two former chief justices in British Columbia saying that they didn't believe the anti-polygamy law would withstand a charter challenge because the charter guarantees religious freedom in Canada.
Is this a matter of religious freedom?
No, it's a matter of child abuse. It's a matter of being an abuse of human rights because the women and children have no freedom to think, to associate, to choose their most intimate partner.
Yeah.
So to me, it's an abuse of human rights.
What about this lost boy phenomena we hear about down in the States? Is that something happening in Bountiful?
Well, it has to happen. The arithmetic of polygamy is that we come into the world in equal numbers, and the arithmetic of polygamy says that if one man has several wives, it means that a number of others don't get any. So Winston Blackmore, 26 wives, it means 25 men without wives. So the boys are either convinced out, encouraged out, or kicked out.
Okay. And you interview a lot of these in your book,
Yes.
Okay, great. Any final words you'd like to share with my readers, or I guess in this case, listeners?
I think that people get too hung up on the notion of religious freedom. I think it is a question. The question in Texas is very much just child abuse. One of the problems in British Columbia is that there hasn't been a panic phone call from a 16-year-old saying that she's pregnant and has already had a child by a 50-year-old man. And if that phone call were to come, I'm assured that the BC government would go in and take the children out as well, but that hasn't happened. So one of the really big problems in terms of getting a prosecution and ending this is that there have to be people from within the community who actually come out and tell the truth about what's going on.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
There we go. Let's just slap this off.